Well, thank you. Thank you all for coming out here today. I'm impressed as many people are awake in Stamford. It's great to be back out here with this beautiful view. I grew up just about 15 miles down the shoreline here, so it's very, very at home being back here. The speech you heard last night from the president was an interesting one, not his favorite milieu, sitting in front of the teleprompter in the Oval Office, so not the way he prefers to go communicate. But what struck me, apart from the argument about the wall and so forth and so on, is how it is that you see a new president who comes in structure their concept of what are national security threats to the United States. And certainly we have had and have immigration issues, drug issues coming across the border, some criminal issues. We have yet to find a case of a serious act of terrorism that's taken place in the United States from somebody who came across the southern border. There's been a hole in their argument you saw he didn't make yesterday. But what struck me about it was this. If you go back to the intelligence agency's assessments, we wrote about this a little bit with some of my colleagues in the Times last night and this morning for those of you who are still reading the Dead Sea edition. When you go through the intelligence agency's assessments of what are the major threats facing the United States, which is a report that they have to give each year to Congress, is usually a 20-page or so unclassified version and then a more detailed classified version of it. When you go through that, not surprisingly, after 9/11, terrorism was the major threat for basically a decade. And this report itself is an interesting sort of Rorschach test of what people are concerned about. If you go to the 2007 version of the report, just 6 years after 9/11, you all remember we were all still in both period of great shock, but also in sort of the worst days of the Iraq War back then. You went through the list. It was terrorism, rise of China, nuclear proliferation issues, other weapons of mass destruction. You have to go pretty far down, page 15 or 16, before you hit the drug trafficking, southern border kind of issues. But in 2007, if you went to go read the cyber section of the report, it wouldn't take you very long. There is no cyber section of the National Threat Assessment just 11 years ago. That came out, it always comes out in February. A few weeks after the 2007 report came out, Steve Jobs showed up in San Francisco, and I've given our beautiful view here. I don't have my slides with me, but I've got one of him holding up the first iPhone, right? Which looks a lot more blocky than this does. Actually, if you held a first version of the iPhone now, it kind of seems like a small brick to you. But in any case, that began to change everything, because for the first time, you not only had the great convenience of mobile computing, and you had the discovery among people that the least interesting part of the phone you were carrying was its phone function. And over time, the part that you use the least, why we still call it a phone, is somewhat amusing, right? But for the first time, you had all of the computing power, the search power that you wanted, the email power, traveling with you, which meant that it was traveling in every environment that you were going into. No longer did people have to worry about breaking into Dan's old offices at Xerox, because anybody with an iPhone in their pocket was walking them into Xerox for them. So that if you got into the mobile computing platform, you were into the corporate network, or you were into the government network, which is why when in the course of my normal day in Washington, I end up 3 or 4 times a day putting the phone in one of those ridiculous little cubbies in the State Department or the Pentagon or the White House or whatever, because you're going into areas where they actually just don't allow telephones to go run anymore, because they're basically a moving surveillance device. So where are we in the national threat assessment now? About 5 years ago, cyber, not having appeared at all in '07, emerged as the #1 threat facing the United States, ahead of proliferation, ahead of Putin's aggression from Russia, ahead of the rise of China, so forth and so on. And then proliferation, then terrorism, then all these other issues, and it pushed the border issues down a few more. What I found striking about the speech was, and other speeches the president's given, is you would have no sense of that ordering of priority if you were just listening to the President of the United States these days. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens next month when Dan Coates, the Director of National Intelligence, has to go turn out his next version. And I would bet that cyber will once again show up at the top of the list. So, why is that? Why is it that cyber is showing up at the top? It's not just the surveillance capability that we are all familiar with. It's a worry, but it's not an enormous worry. We had surveillance capabilities in voice and video before the invention of mobile computing. It's that cyber allows states to begin to do something that they never could do before. They could actually turn this into a short of war weapon. And the phrase short of war is critical, because we've sort of passed the days when any significant player on the world scene is going to take on the United States directly. Putin's got a failing economy. The Chinese don't have the military reach. The Europeans are having a hard enough time figuring out what they are to organize a significant, military force beyond NATO. We're busy dissing NATO along the way. So the countries are going to go compete and undercut each other. They have to do it using a new technological device that they can calibrate so that they can pursue their goals without prompting a major military retaliation. And that's what cyber is brilliant for. And it explains why the book is titled The Perfect Weapon. It's perfect because it's stealthy, it's deniable, you can dial it up and down in ways you cannot dial up and down, say, a nuclear weapon. Right? Nuclear weapons come in two varieties, on or off. Okay? If you drop one, for all that we're hearing about Kim Jong-un and so forth, and you're the one who drops it, you probably feel really good about it for about 45 minutes. And that's about the last thing you'll remember. With a cyber weapon, it's entirely different. Because it's deniable, because it's stealthy, because it's dirt cheap, you can actually go produce them quickly and deploy them well. And it's the reason that the United States itself has adopted cyber as its primary means of going after states where we do not want to admit to it, or we do not want to risk an overall war. So the most famous, the Hiroshima moment for the United States in cyber was something called Operation Olympic Games, which was the effort started by the Bush administration and accelerated by President Obama to go after Iran's nuclear centrifuges prior to the 2015 nuclear agreement. It was an effort to sort of combine a covert operation with the very public financial pressure of sanctions in order to force Iran to the negotiating table. You won't read about it in George W. Bush's book Decision Points, and I'm sure you won't read about it in President Obama's forthcoming memoir, although when it's forthcoming, we are all sort of sitting around wondering. It's supposed to be out before his wife's. He's having too much of a good time playing golf and giving speeches. You won't read about it because these are all still the most deeply classified programs the U.S. government has. And as you'll read in The Perfect Weapon, I argue that the deep secrecy that has surrounded cyber has actually begun to get in our own way, because we haven't had a very big public debate about how we want to go use these weapons. And Olympic Games was really the key moment at which it surfaced all of the questions about what happens when you do use them. So let's dwell for a moment on what it was that happened in Olympic Games and the issues it raised, and then what's happened since we deployed that weapon, which was just 7 years ago. So you'll remember that President Bush had come out of the Iraq War unable to ever again declare that a country had nuclear weapons. He said to me at one point, toward the end of his presidency, I can't publicly go up and give a speech about Iran and say they've got nuclear weapons, because everybody will say, yeah, just like Iraq did. But of course, in Iran, it was a very different evidentiary base, that they were building their way toward weapons. They didn't have any weapons at the time, but they certainly had significant ability to produce nuclear fuel through the centrifuges that were deep in the ground at Natanz, their main nuclear enrichment site. So one day a couple of generals and intelligence officials came to them and said, Mr. President, we've got another way to go do this. We think that we can get into the computer controllers that run those centrifuges, alter the code so that the centrifuges, which spin at supersonic speeds, would speed up or slow down. Like a top, they'll grow wobbly, and they'll blow up. If any of you have seen the documentary we did out of my last book, Confront and Conceal, it's an Alex Gibney documentary called 0 Days, you will get a sense of exactly how this operated, because we sort of take you inside the centrifuges and how this worked. And President Bush didn't really believe this would work, but he authorized them to go test it out. So they went down to Tennessee, borrowed some centrifuges that had kindly been turned over to us by Muammar Gaddafi when he gave up his very nascent nuclear program. They were still sitting in the boxes with Khan Research Lab Pakistan stamped on them. When I went to see them, they tried to black that out. All you had to do was flash a flashlight over the black part. You could see it. It's kind of like reading about Paul Manafort. Yesterday. The last time the lawyers ever tried to do the blackout without seeing whether you can click on your computer and unredact it, as we were all doing yesterday. The code was used to go try to take a few of these centrifuges. They built a model of the Natanz plant in a hillside in Tennessee. They attacked it with the code, blew up the centrifuges, took the remnants of them, put them on an airplane, flew them to D.C., rolled them into the northwest gate of the White House, dumped them out on the Situation Room table, invited President Bush down to see the shards of the system. And he looked at it and he said something I shouldn't say in a nice but it began with O. And so he authorized them to go out and begin the attacks. And it was fascinating because for the first year or two, the Iranians couldn't figure out whether their systems were blowing up because of something that we were doing to mess with them or something the Israelis were doing to mess with them. We had done this in conjunction with Israel. Or whether they were blowing up because they had made engineering mistakes, or because, Iran's equivalent of OSHA had not, carefully put together the workforce or whatever. They began firing scientists. searching around. Worked wonderfully until one day when the code got out. Wasn't anybody's fault. A lot of different theories and arguments about why the code got out. The one I find most credible is that an Iranian engineer who was working on the computer systems with his laptop, that the virus, which was, you all heard the name Stuxnet, got into their computer system. He then went home. The virus thought it was still inside Natanz. He hooked up to the internet. It began to spread around. And in the summer of 2010, sitting in the newsroom in New York, we were all looking at this virus beginning to spread around the world. There were hundreds of thousands of copies. India, Indonesia, then the United States, and so forth. And as we began to pick it apart, we discovered characteristics in it, because cyber malware has in it specific characteristics that make it pretty clear who the authors may well have been. And in this particular case, there were sections that were written in forms that were pretty clearly written by people who had been trained in Israel, some in the United States. And the virus only went live, as I discovered as I was in Germany trying to go sort this issue out with somebody who was picking the code apart. It only went live when it found clusters of 164 machines together. This German guy who was working on it said, "This is bizarre." And I said, "Well, no, it's not bizarre at all. The Iranians organized their centrifuges in groups of 164, which I just knew from years of covering the Iranian nuclear program." At that point, it became pretty evident what was going on. And my last book took us back through the decision making, which took a while to dig out, as two presidents had ordered this thing together, as Obama would go down into the sit room and look at this giant, what they used to call the horse blanket, a design of the Natanz plant, and help target what parts of the plant they were going to go attack, the way Lyndon Johnson, sitting in the same room, used to sit there and help pick out bombing targets in Vietnam. But Obama had a warning, and his warning was pretty simple. Look, one day he said this is going to get out. I don't think he intended it to get out in the New York Times in June of 2012 the way it did, but he knew one day it would get out. And when it does, every other country in the world that's attacking us anyway, or wants to attack us, is going to say, this is now legit. We're into this whole new world. And that's exactly what happened. Within a few months of the revelation of Olympic Games, the Iranians brought down 30,000 computers at Saudi Aramco, the biggest oil producer in Saudi Arabia. The Iranians attacked Chase Manhattan Bank, Bank of America. Anybody here who's in the financial sector and remembers the summer of 2012, 2013, that was pretty hellish as we were doing. So the banks were doing everything they could to keep it out of the news that they were under significant attack. The Russians came in, and long before we were concerned about election interference, they were going after a number of targets: the State Department, the White House, the Joint Chiefs of Staff. On the surveillance side, the North Koreans, of course, came in and did what became the most public hack of the United States of all, which was the attack on Sony. And that was a truly destructive attack. Well, the headlines all went to the fact that they revealed some emails within Sony, which was sort of interesting. It was an early harbinger of what was going to happen in the 2016 election cycle. The news there was not that Angelina Jolie can be extremely difficult to work with on the set. The news was that the North Koreans got into the Sony systems, rooted around them for months very carefully, which is what you do when you do a cyber attack. It's not just a break-in and attack. Managed to figure out how their computer systems ran their accounting, how it ran their personnel stuff, how it ran the movie-making stuff, where they stored future movies, where they did the scheduling, and so forth. They were there from September of 2014 through just around Thanksgiving, when they launched the attack. the attack, when you came into Sony in the morning, you saw a skull and crossbones and lots of garbage on your screen and so forth, and that was all meant as a giant distraction, because while you were staring at that, your hard drive was erasing itself. And in about 3 minutes, Sony lost 70% of their computing power at Sony Pictures Entertainment. Called in the FBI, who set up in one of the movie lots. That was pretty, talk about life imitating art. And then the question came, how do you retaliate for this? Okay? So one of the briefers goes in to see Obama, and Obama's trying to figure out, is this an act of vandalism? Is this an act of sabotage? Is this an act of war? How do we go deal with this? And why would an act of war begin with an attack launched because James Franco turned out a really terrible movie? Which was, of course, what this was all about. It was a political act because of it. A movie called The Interview, which, if you haven't seen, has anybody here seen it? More people than I would expect. For the rest of you, I can save 2 hours of your life. You can skip this one. But basically the plot is that a couple of journalists are sent off to go interview Kim Jong-un. They get intercepted by the CIA, who tries to, sets them up to assassinate him on the way out. Now, having lived in newsrooms for the past 36 years, I can tell you, if you were going to hire some hitmen, I cannot think of a worse pool for They're probably the group most likely to screw up the job. But that said, that was the movie. The North Koreans didn't like it. They did what you naturally do if you wanted to stop a movie from coming. They wrote a letter to the Secretary General of the United Nations asking him to use his deep influence in Hollywood to halt it. Shockingly, that failed. And they moved on to the cyber option. Now, the North Koreans were not done. They figured out, gee, if you can blow up a movie production company doing this, certainly you can use it to steal money. And so they got into the Central Bank of Bangladesh and figured out how they use the SWIFT system, which is how international transactions are cleared, sent an order to transfer $1 billion to accounts that they had set up in the Philippines. They got 86 million of that before a extremely alert young woman in the New York Fed noticed that the instructions called for transferring it to a foundation that was spelled Foundation. It's just like your mother said, proofread everything. She looked a little more carefully and stopped the thing, but they just got lucky, basically. And then you've seen all of the other ways in which cyber can be used. Obviously against utilities. It was just last spring that we learned from the Department of Homeland Security, which unfortunately is frequently the last to get the news on this kind of stuff, that the Russians were deeply inside almost every major utility in the United States, and there was shocking news. But of course we don't know with what intent, because if you shut down every electric power plant between Boston and Washington, you are likely to get that military response that cyber is intended to avoid. We've discovered that other parts of our infrastructure are incredibly vulnerable. One of my favorite attacks on the US was the shutdown of the Sands Casino. Imagine if you're really going to hurt, you really know how to hurt a country, right? And that one came about after the Iranians saw Sheldon Adelson, a very large conservative donor who owns the Sands Casino, argue for dropping a nuclear weapon in the Iranian desert to go teach them a lesson. And they said, well, desert, casino, Adelson, we can probably send a message before he gets around to that. And of course, one day, all of his workers came into the San Spacino and turned on their computers and discovered that it had been Sonyized, and spent months trying to keep us from learning about that. Fortunately, they failed. So what does that tell you? You've got a broad spectrum weapon here. It can be used for surveillance, can be used for destruction, and as we have learned in the past 2 years and are still wrapped up in, can be used in influence operations. Nothing the Russians did in the 2016 election cycle was particularly new. Stalin used to run disinformation campaigns. What was new was that they figured out how to use our connectivity against us, right? That you would go on Facebook and look for messages and think that it was written by, you know, if not your neighbor in Stamford, then somebody in, say, faraway Greenwich, when instead it came out of St. Petersburg. Not St. Petersburg, Florida, but St. Petersburg, Russia, where the Internet Research Agency was. And one of the most fascinating indictments to read is the Internet Research Agency indictment that that Special Counsel Mueller turned out back last summer, and then he did one for the GRU, the Russian intelligence agencies. And so it was the GRU that went into the Democratic National Committee, got the emails, published them, weaponized them in that regard. And one of the big arguments that I make in the book is that we had a huge failure of deterrence. By not going after the GRU and others when they went into the State Department and the White House and all that, by concluding that that is simply another act of spying, we do it, they do it, you know, shame on us for being vulnerable, we had a failure of imagination about what they would go do. And if you're Vladimir Putin, you think, well, gee, they're not going to go react when we go into the White House or the State Department. Who's going to care about the DNC, which is run by a bunch of college kids? And he was right. And in fact, when you look at President Obama's reaction to the news in the summer of 2016 of what happened to the DNC, they weren't really aware of the social media side of this at the time. There were all kinds of proposals about how to go retaliate against the Russians. One was cut off their access to the world financial markets. One was expose Putin's relationships to the oligarchs and the money he's hidden away. I'm not quite sure what they were thinking. I mean, you know, this just in, Vladimir Putin's got deep friends among the oligarchs, and they hide billions of dollars of cash for him, okay? But in the end, what they did was simply warn Putin privately. Why? Because they were worried that if they did something more, he would come back on election day. And they didn't know how vulnerable the actual voting systems were. Now, what we've learned since, fortunately, is they're not especially vulnerable, because they are so old and so antiquated that they are largely offline. Because every state does this in a different way. Because most states don't know how they do it in the next county. And we were actually protected by our own incredible incompetence in how we sort of organize elections. Less that, there are some things that you actually don't want to have online. And you know, your election systems are one of them. You probably don't want an Alexa in the bedroom, right? That would be a second. I've never figured out why people are buying internet-connected refrigerators. I guess if it told me to eat less or something. But yeah, there are some things that you simply don't want vulnerable to all this, and election systems are among them. But what did that lesson teach us? Last thought on this before we go to your questions. We have the most sophisticated and advanced cyber offensive capability in the world. As I've reported, and the end of the book takes you into a left of launch program, we used them against the North Korean missile program. We've used them against the Iranians, as I described. We use them not to very good effect against the Islamic State. We've had places where it's worked. We've had places where it hasn't worked. We've had lots of operations I haven't learned about yet, I'm sure. But we have been very cautious about using them or threatening to use them against major powers, because we realized that great as our offense is, we are also the most vulnerable nation on earth. Because in cyber, all the advantage goes to the least wired societies attacking the most wired. That was a lesson of the North Korea case. Yeah, President Obama could have gone back and fried the IP addresses in North Korea. But there are fewer IP addresses in North Korea than there are on one block of downtown Stamford, right? Whereas to the North Koreans, all we are is a series of targets, some well defended in the financial industry, or the utility industry, some terribly defended. Sony, Marriott, as we've learned, or at least their old Starwood group. I mean, every week you pick up news and you see, you know, another major hack from another company that thought, well, how could we have known that we should have, as Marriott said, encrypted the passport data that our guests were giving us? I didn't think that was actually such a big leap, but apparently they did. The result is you're not going to be willing to go use your offense as a deterrent if you don't have a well-sewn-up defense. And we don't have a well-sewn-up defense because 85% of the networks in the United States are in private hands, and it's not like the US government can go command private companies how to go do this, and not everything is of equal value. You want to defend Con Ed from turning off the power before you actually want to go out and defend Marriott. I wouldn't have minded an Oval Office address at some point that said, my fellow Americans, we got this big problem, a huge vulnerability. It's so much bigger than anything from a couple of thousand people coming over the border, or even tens of thousands of people coming over the border, because in this world there are no borders. No wall will help you. So we have to think wildly differently about how we defend our systems, and wildly differently about how we conduct deterrence. I'll leave on a last note involving a Connecticut resident, Henry Kissinger, got his house up in Canada. He wrote a book in the 1950s called Nuclear Weapons and Foreign Policy, and it was the first sort of public explanation of how we sort of put together deterrence for a world in which we were all vulnerable to nuclear weapons. Every problem we had in nuclear, we had in cyber. Every solution we came up with in nuclear does not apply in cyber. I went to go talk to Kissinger a number of times about this, and he said to me, you know, David, this is so much more complicated than anything that we dealt with in the nuclear age. That has not sunk in fully with the US government, or even with its citizenry, which is one of the main reasons I wrote the Perfect Weapon. So I will go to your questions, and I thank you very much for having me here, and appreciate it.
David, thank you very much. It was either in your book or another book I read that talks about maybe a Geneva agreement on cyber. And I wonder if you could talk about how that might look and what status that is in.
The concept is a sort of digital Geneva Convention. The theory being there's no writing treaties in this area. It's no arms control talks that you can go do. This is one of the reasons it's different than nuclear. In nuclear, we had weapons, the Soviets had weapons, the Chinese had a few, and then it went down. So if you knew who you were dealing with, and they were in the control of a few people. In cyber, treaties won't work because states have weapons, criminal groups have weapons, terrorists have weapons, teenagers have weapons. I don't know what it's like in your household. When my household was full of teenagers, they didn't sign treaties. Okay? So then the question is, do you create some norms of behavior the way the Geneva Conventions do? Now, what were the Geneva Conventions intended to do? To set up some rules of war. Some of them started, they had their roots before World War I. The conventions, as we think of them today, came out of a conference that was not organized by a government, but was organized by the Red Cross. And the idea was to protect civilians. And while there are lots of flaws in it, Bashar Assad wakes up every morning thinking about how he can go violate the Geneva Conventions, and usually by the end of the day has done a pretty good job of it. We come to recognize there are certain things you do not do to civilians, and one day maybe Mr. Assad will show up at the International Court at The Hague and have to go answer for this. We don't know. A digital Geneva Convention would basically try to wall off civilians, which means saying election systems are off limits, or electrical grids are off limits, or emergency communication systems are off limits, or hospitals and nursing homes are off limits. I mean, if we all just sat down at the end of breakfast and made a list, probably in 5 or 10 minutes we'd have a pretty comprehensive list coming out of the past. Now imagine for a minute, to understand the scope of the problem, that you're Mike Pompeo and you get this list and you circulate it to your government colleagues. Dear acting cabinet member. I forward to you this list that we're going to start discussing with the Chinese and the Russians about a digital Geneva Convention. It would cut off interference in X, Y, and Z. My guess is that by the next morning, the intelligence agencies have organized a meeting in the Situation Room, right where Obama was picking out those targets, that says, wait, we can't cut off an American president's ability to go mess with a future election someplace. I mean, after all, we messed with elections in Italy in the 1940s, and South America in the 50s and 60s, and Japan and South Korea. Supposing they concluded that by messing with the next election, you could deal with Maduro without actually having to get into a conflict. Who wants to go do that? Electrical grid? Yeah, we don't like it when the Russians are in our electrical grid, but those of you who've read the book already have learned about a program called Nitro Zeus, which was the US effort to design a program, if we did go to war with Iran, to flip off all of their electricity and all of their communication systems in hopes that we could end the war without firing a shot. So this is going to get really complicated, because my guess is that the first country that would refuse to sign the Digital Geneva Conventions would be us.
Yeah, I have a question. Let me give you an example. I was in Manhattan in 9/11, and I couldn't find what was going on. Everybody was on their phones. You couldn't get through. And I was trying to get out, and couldn't find where the trains were working. And in 02 or 03, I was driving back from Erie, and the power went out. And I almost had to camp in my car because all the gas stations were shut because they didn't have power. So, I mean, these are two small examples. But could our internet be shut down? It seems like, I mean, we're, to your point, we're sort of dependent on our phones for everything.
Yeah.
Could they shut down our internet for an hour, a week, a month?
A year, several years. So about 97% of the internet traffic that you depend on goes across fiber optic cables. And those fiber optic cables are laid undersea in the same patterns as the fiber optic cables that Alexander Graham Bell laid down in the 1800s, because we know where those tracks in the sea are and we're confident in them. What have the Russians been doing in recent times just to play with our minds? They've been running submarines, specially designed submarines, along the fiber optic cable path, mapping them out. These aren't just ordinary submarines, they actually come with a giant scissors in front. I'm not kidding. A cord cutting method. We have some of these as well. So supposing you snipped the cables, and there are only about 140 of them, that supply most of the continental United States. You could put it out pretty quickly. A lot of private companies have another concern, which is if you are on a public cable, in other words, the ones that are used by the telephone utilities and all that, your phone calls run over them, your internet traffic runs over them, and an emergency happens, the government can throw the companies off, right? They've got that right. So Facebook, Microsoft, Apple, Google, they all looked at this and said, hell with this. We've got all the money in the world. Why don't we lay our own cables and we'll just keep the US government out of it? Especially after the Snowden revelations, where we discovered that the US government was not beyond tapping into some of these cables to get between some of the Google traffic overseas. And so they have quietly begun laying their own cable. Facebook and Microsoft, if I have this right, have a joint agreement. Yeah, it's only a couple of $2 billion. It's not like a big deal for them, right? So, so here they are beginning to lay private cable because they're concerned about exactly what you're concerned.
In light of the recent DOJ policy of naming and shaming, can you speak to that a little bit on how the OPM hack would actually impact Tradecraft and the individuals involved in conducting that Tradecraft, and how it speaks to the how it might change our overall strategy and such?
So let me, very good question, let me unpack two parts of that for people who might not know this. Anybody here who ever had a security clearance or applied for a security clearance probably got one of those nice letters from the Office of Personnel Management, the most boring bureaucracy in Washington, saying, we're terribly sorry, but we never actually encrypted your data. A point I made to Marriott when they were saying to me, well, how could we have known we should have encrypted the data? And we lost all of it to some foreign intruder, we don't want to say who. We don't know. Of course they knew. It was Chinese intelligence. Had been in the system for about a year. And the US, during the Obama years, never named the Chinese except one time when Jim Clapper, the former DNI, bless him, blurted it out in an interview with Andrea Mitchell, and then was forced to go back and eat his words later on. But he actually did utter the truth, which we had published in the Times many times along the way, that it was a Chinese operation, as was Marriott, as was Anthem, because they're building these giant databases. So then the question comes, is it better not to name them, which was largely what happened in the Obama era, or is it better to go call them out, which the Trump administration has begun doing with more vigor? The only one that Obama folks called out was North Korea. I think it helps. I think it's honesty. It's embarrassing, right? To explain that your systems were wide open because OPM stored their data in the unused computer systems of the Interior Department, where they got all the same protections that say bison migration in Yellowstone. But we haven't seen a huge amount of evidence yet that for determined state actors it actually alters their calculus. I think over time it might, because you would be more cautious about investing in a country that's caught doing this frequently.
David, how effectively do you think we're staffed in our government with regard to cybersecurity personnel? Are they vulnerable to being picked off by, technology companies at higher rates of pay? Where are we in that? What kind of a grade would you give us on that?
It's a very good question. So the NSA and others still manage to attract extremely good, young, cyber-savvy folks because they can offer them something that money can't buy. The opportunity to go legally break into foreign computer systems, design things like Olympic Games. What used to be known inside the NSA as the Tailored Access Operations Group, which is a group that does this, is sort of the premier group that could go do this. The problem comes when people get married, have 2 kids, and move to Stamford, and suddenly have a mortgage, and the appeal of going off and getting 3 times your pay from a private company is pretty high. Right. So they do have a problem there. Our bigger problem is not that. It's not even that we don't have enough people. It's that we don't have them well organized for this. We have divided the responsibility for domestic protection outside of government networks and the Defense Department to the Department of Homeland Security. Want to feel better? In the course of the furlough, now 2 weeks long, of the US government, in order to go solve our border problem, we have furloughed 45%, I checked on this last night for something we were doing, of everybody who works in the cyber division of the Department of Homeland Security.
Wow.
Did anybody stop in the US government to say, hey, to achieve one security goal, we're actually undermining a much bigger, more important one? Astoundingly, that didn't happen. So that's our second problem. Our third problem is that we haven't quite figured out, as my talk suggested, the offense-defense side of this. Now, there was created and sort of built up in the Obama administration a White House cyber coordinator who was supposed to be the place where the offense and defensive strategy merged. And actually, the Trump administration got off to a pretty good start. They had a Homeland Security advisor who was pretty cyber savvy. They brought in the guy who used to run the TAO to be the cybersecurity coordinator, a guy named Rob Joyce. Then John Bolton got appointed in April. We're on National Security Advisor number 3, and I think if you've been covering our coverage of how he and the president have dealt with Syria, you could well be on to number 4 sometime. The first thing he did was get rid of the Homeland Security Advisor and replace him with an extremely nice Coast Guard admiral who conceded to me the other day that he knows a lot about how to deal with hurricanes, but they've never really dealt with cyber. And for the cybersecurity coordinator, he eliminated the post. This would have been like in 1959 saying, you don't actually need anybody to go figure out this nuclear strategy stuff. It'll just kind of happen. So that's where we are. And so I'm less worried about the numbers of people we have than I am with how we've organized them. Same reason that the debate about whether the defense budget should be bigger or smaller, I find a lot less interesting than the question of why we're not focusing it on this series of new technologies.
Final question.
I got a good final question.
Okay. Got it.
I'll prove it too.
It pays to lobby.
I did read the book. I highly recommend it to those who haven't. On a personal note, I have to believe that there's a bright foreign intelligence service that would like to know what you know and what others at the Times know in the places like that. To the extent that you want to comment, on a personal note, what are the sort of things that you have to do to keep other people, foreigners, outside of the Times network in your own personal life?
So there were a very good question. There are a lot of people in the Times network, and they're actually not really worried about David Sanger. I mean, the Chinese came in an extremely big way after we wrote that series of stories about how the Prime Minister of China's family was enriching itself. They found parts of our computer system I haven't been able to find in 3 decades. I suggested at one point that we hire them for our training courses. Clearly figured out stuff about our system that we did not. So for the stuff I truly care about, which is protecting sources, I simply don't put it in electronic form. The last book I did, Confront and Conceal, resulted in one of the largest leak investigations in American history. It was the one into how we learned what we learned about Olympic Games. And the only person who was ever indicted on it was the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, not for leaking any information to me, but because in his email they discovered that he had a series of meetings with me at various points. And that's part of the problem. We all lead a huge world of digital dust behind us. by virtue of the fact that every time you go on Google Maps, somebody can go track you, and if you're not on Google Maps, a local telephone service can track you. When I go overseas, I don't bring my main computer or my main, right? If I'm going to Russia or China, I basically bring a burner computer and a burner phone. But the fact of the matter is, they're going to be able to get into some systems. If any of you are still reliant on just passwords instead of two-factor authentication, which you're familiar of when the bank sends you back a 6-digit, system or something like that, you want two-factor authentication. I use for my personal email a system that Google and others have put out now, in which you actually have to put into your computer a key that looks like this, goes into the USB system, and press a button on it. So there's got to be a human being going into a key that's registered your way, to your computer, which is pretty effective for somebody who might get your password and try to use it in a computer system that Google didn't recognize. And I'm a big advocate of this system as better than the method of sending something back to your cell phone, because if you're in a country where the state owns the cell system, like say China or Russia or many places in Europe, sending them the 6 digits may not be the best way to go about preserving their security. So.